Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series 2022. First and last for 2022. We're a little slow getting started this year, but we're here and we've got some speakers lined up for next semester as well. So excited to be back in person and virtually. And what a great way to kick off our inaugural event and to have our past provost, is that the right term? Sure. Dr. Teri Balser here. So I'm going to ask David to formally introduce her.
Okay. Right, so as Jolene says, this is a wonderful way for us to kickstart our visiting speaker series. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Teri Balser, Dr. Teri Balser, friend and colleague. I've had the privilege to work very closely with Teri when she was the provost and the acting president of Dalhousie University. And all of the incredible work she did in developing largely the strategic plan that we now have at Dalhousie University as well. Most of you will have seen the bio, but there's some great things in here. Teri's been honored as a U.S. National Science Foundation Early Career Award winner. She is a fellow of the Soil Science Society of America. It's a long list. She's been recognized as John Curtin Distinguished Professor, USDA National Excellence in College and University Teaching Award, and 2010 U.S. Professor of the Year for Doctoral and Research Universities. In 2016, one of 3 finalists for the Robert Foster Cherry Award for Great Teaching, an active advocate speaker, workshop facilitator. In 2018, she was named a Principal Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. I'm one of those too. Hey, neat. Okay. For her work in teaching and learning, she co-founded the Society for It Goes On and On and On. The one thing that's there's more than one thing, but working with Teri is her passion for learning and the student-centered approach that she takes, actually people-centered approach that she takes. It's absolutely incredible, and her always looking to challenge convention and ask questions as to, well, why do we do it that way? And there's always got to be a better way of doing it, and certainly challenge the deans around the dean's table to think in that way as well. Creativity and as a catalyst as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you this afternoon, Teri. And wonderful to have you back. This is your home, so thank you for coming. Thank you.
Excellent. Well. All right, we'll make sure we can go ahead and get the slides going. I think it record.
We're good. And everybody at home can hear us?
We can hear you great.
In fact, I know that you're being recorded, so I just have to put that little thing in there.
Right, the owl is speaking to you.
The owl is creepy guys.
Just need one of those laser, like those projections like in Disney and the rides where it's actually speaking with a little owl mouth. That would be great. All right, well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. It really is nice to come back and visit and just share a few of the things that I've been up to, some of the things that I've been thinking about lately, and some of the things that I've been thinking about in an ongoing way throughout my career. Some of you know, I started into full-time senior leadership as the first female dean of the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences at the University of Florida. And some of these things come all the way back from there. But even before that, I was a land grant baby, right? So the US land grant, which is that idea of extension, that the products of the university should belong to the people. They should be useful to the communities that we serve. And so my PhD at Berkeley is a land grant university. And then I did my first 10 years as a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is also one of the land grant universities. And the Wisconsin idea is truly the idea that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. And so I've been really fascinated with thinking about the role of universities as contributors to the public good, to social good, for a very, very long time. And so what I wanted to do today was just share some of the things that I've been playing with and thinking about and throw them out there to see what you might think. And get a sense of, well, what does that mean for us here? What does it mean for other universities across Canada as well? So that's kind of where we're going with us today. So just a bit of context, because I like to give context about why am I even standing here talking? And I shared a little bit of where I hope to go. But what it is that where I'm coming from, part one, is that we know that our role and the responsibility of universities and faculties is changing. It's particularly true now. The world is accelerating. Things are getting more complex. Governments are changing, socio-political unrest, you name it, right? And especially if you look south of us in the US, there's all kinds of crazy things going on when it comes to higher education and governments censoring and limiting academic freedom and challenges to free speech and all kinds of crazy stuff happening. And it's only a matter of time until it starts to trickle north as well. And so I have a concern about that. We're also being asked to be more engaged with the world in a lot of ways, right? That we're actually trying to put our PhDs into industry and into new and different types of things. Also, like I mentioned, the socio-political activity that's out there, just increasing levels of government oversight, involvement, opinion, name it what you want to name it, and need to have more involvement with a wider range of our stakeholders. And yet at the same time, we aren't necessarily set up to recognize and reward that kind of engagement and that kind of involvement and that wide range that we seem to now be being called to do. And there's some skepticism, right, that people have about universities and whether we're all just entitled, tenured faculty who sit around and do nothing in the summer and only teach a couple classes, right? There's opinion out there that is, as we move toward market forces and thinking about the students as customers and a degree as something to be purchased, rather than that role that we play for discovery and the role that's necessary for us and kind of leading the way. So these are things that concern me, and that's kind of where I'm coming from as well. But we also we need to figure out, how do we adjust this? How do we defend who we are and what we are? And this idea that we have to have strong universities, like that's critical. Hopefully nobody in this room disagrees with that, which leads to some of the other questions that I've been asking, and just in the last couple of years, right? What does it mean anymore to be a public research university? What does it mean to be a great research university? What does it mean to be a research university? And the credibility and relevance of our research is also being called into question across all of North America. And I think COVID brought that into stark relief in a lot of ways with the sort of anti-science. And then anybody that had been following the climate change debates also would see that people are skeptical about what universities do and what university research means. So for me, one of the questions, and I asked this a couple of years ago when I started at the University of Calgary, which is these questions: who do we serve? How do we serve them? Why do we exist? And how has that changed, or has that changed? And we did I think it was 37 different virtual workshops and probably about 700 people wrestling with this question and really starting to think about, well, where are we going in post-secondary education, which that's what PSE stands for, but I didn't want to break the line, so so really thinking about where are we going? So that's context part one. Context part two, as I mentioned, is that the world is changing incredibly fast in very dramatic ways. That is environmental, technical, technological, and social, political. All of these things are just changing so fast. And compared to some of the problems that we are maybe accustomed to addressing or have addressed in the past, these are not technical problems. They're not linear problems. They're not simple problems. They are highly, whoa, wow, that was cool. I didn't know it could do that. It's like the touchpad is super sticky or touchy. Touchpad that's touchy, imagine that. So these are the world is changing really, really fast. And these are complex problems. They're not technical problems. They're not simple to fix. They're hard to pull apart. And they're nonlinear. They're wicked sometimes has been the term, but they're really not easy to address. So we know that complex problems require adaptive and creative solutions, not technical fixes. They need more than just that. And we also know that universities may or may not be set up to allow for those kinds of complex, creative, adaptive solutions. So I love this image. I mean, of course, it's ag image, right? But to me, it gets at that idea that there's these boundaries between our disciplines and between different aspects of the university. And we need to be aware of those, or we are aware of those. Our degree programs are set up this way. Things are all organized around these silos. And where this comes from, of course, is that our whole system of public higher education in North America was designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore. It came directly out of the first and second, the early industrial ages. And the metaphor that underlies all of it is that we are producing a product that is intended to be uniform, that is according to the age of manufacture, the date of manufacture, if you listen to Sir Ken Robinson. So we put students through in batches by age, rather than necessarily by competence or interest or skill, but we put them through in this, we have line managers and we have a hierarchical ordered system that is derivative of the industrial age. And yet that's not where we are anymore. And a few years ago, I gave a talk in Bangkok, actually for UNESCO, looking at what it means to be entering the fourth industrial revolution. And so we are actually, and I didn't at that time even realize that we were in a fourth industrial revolution. I thought there was one and done, but no. And so there's been some real interesting changes if we look at how things have shifted over time as we've moved into what is now the fourth industrial, which is cyber physical systems, and going away from the age of knowledge, going away from just simply automation to now wearable devices and smart toilets and smart refrigerators and goodness knows what else, right? And that's what we mean by cyber physical systems, that we're becoming increasingly integrated with the technologies that are out there. And I know this is a faculty that's aware of that. There's not a single piece of anything that we do in human existence anymore that's not impacted by what's happening with this fourth industrial revolution. So I've just been seeing all these articles lately as well about AI, right? AI writing papers, AI doing teaching, AI doing everything for us, doing art, all of it. So every single aspect of what we do is being impacted by these technological changes. And so that one up in the top corner up there is the driver distractor. You probably knew that already, but I just the whole thing, which I think takes a lot of the fun out of what I learned when I was in Wisconsin, the concept of recreational tillage, and that the students that grew up, the kids that were the farm kids, that was the thing to do, was to go out and drive the tractor because it was enjoyable, relaxing, fun. It was something that was recreational for them. And so as a soil scientist, I hated having to teach them that tillage and excess tillage is a bad thing for the health of the soil. And I was like, well, can you just go drive the tractor around without actually tilling anything? But anyway, I think
Sure can.
what's that?
Then you sure can.
Yeah, I can, but in any case, so it's affecting all of us. And it really comes down, and I've given a number of different talks on what does this mean for us as a university, right? What does that mean? So it's all these big changes coupled with environmental changes, social changes, all of these things. What does it mean for us? And the operative word here is that it means change, right? And humans hate change and universities aren't good at it. And I've given a number of workshops and various other things on change and change management and different things like that, making change work. But the reality is many of us react this way. We run screaming from change because we don't really like it. And universities definitely aren't very good at it. So I've thought a lot about this. Well, okay, what needs to change? How fast does it need to change? Does it really need to change? You heard in the introduction, it's my favorite thing is to just question everything, question the paradigms, question how we do things, question, does it have to still happen that way? If it's good, keep it. If it's not working, get rid of it. And so when I was thinking about coming here and what I might chat about and share a little bit about, I came up with kind of two main dimensions of change that I think are the most critical for us as universities. And the first one is a shift in paradigms in two dimensions. And this is, again, this obviously is arguable or open to debate. We can discuss whether it works or not, or is the right thing or is the wrong thing, or how we do it. We'll go more into how, but how do we change, right? So first of all is to think about shifting that underlying metaphor, that operating model away from industrial to something that's more organic or more systems oriented, right? And I think here we're probably open to the idea of organic and catalysts and things like that. When I talk with other faculties, they don't always necessarily like organic or catalyst, or it's a science metaphor. You're not allowed to use those. Sorry, I can't help it. But we think about this industrial, the underlying assumption is that we're creating cogs in a machine, and that we're machining our students, and our work is to be uniform and to fit as a piece that does the same thing over and over again reliably. And that doesn't really work in this new world. And that the idea is we have kind of a linear system. It is more of a conforming or uniform or rigid or hierarchical system. Now we can pick other words and we can look at the positive sides of it too. This isn't to say it's all negative. It's just, these are some of the dominant features. The shift that we might want to consider making, that I think we should consider making and need to consider making, is more toward a systems approach of thinking about catalysts, not cogs in a machine, and how catalysts work. And so it's more of a nonlinear, a flexible, a dynamic system. It's responsive, and it is more cross-disciplinary, right? So you've got a very different mindset when you're thinking about that more organic systems kind of university. So the way that I've translated that in, and I'm going to give a couple of concrete examples for a few of these in a minute, but the way that I've tried to think about that is, what does that mean for our governance? So right now, even in the most shared governance type universities, there's still an assumption that there is a hierarchy and that things come from the top down. And if you're lucky, there's some attempt at grassroots or engaged, but it's still the leader is the leader and the grassroots is the grassroots. And so the idea that we think about what would an organic system, so I came up with a whole, like, how could you actually have a completely flat university governance in a model that gets rid of the need for an executive. And actually, there's a system that's called sociocracy or dynamic governance that actually is linked to circles. And things get done, and it actually does get done. You don't get stuck in analysis paralysis and nothing ever gets decided. But you can actually truly involve a wide range of people and have a broader, more responsive governance model. I wrote an article for Bioscience several years ago as well, talking about a non-linear, non-hierarchical mode of governance that was more like flickering clusters, where people come together and leadership emerges and things happen, and then it doesn't stay. You don't get stuck in that, and then it dissipates again. And in another area where somebody else has more strength, that leadership emerges to make something happen. Now, obviously, that may or may not work for everything, but it's stuff that, to me, if we're imagining what does this shift look like, things like that might be the hallmark of it, because decisions do still have to be made. Things do still have to get done. Money does exist. There are political systems out there we have to manage within. So that's all still true. So that's the first thing I was thinking of, the first shift, the first big change that is important to try to move toward as much as we can within the means that we have to do so. The second one is a little bit trickier, and I say this knowing that some people may or may not like the words I've used. So argue the words, pick a different word, find something that means something more, fine with me. But the idea of that underlying mindset and what our purpose is and who we are. And I think faculties of agriculture and colleges of agriculture are not as far to one side of this as others are. Other faculties are more so. But this idea of, and I was just thinking cloistering, because it occurred to me that if we are the ones standing on high, handing out the knowledge, and the little picture that's on the left there is from 1139 or something like that. It's a fresco, but it is probably a church. And I often use it because if it was blown up really big, you can see that people are sleeping in the back corner and somebody's looking at their tablet and somebody else is talking to somebody and nudging them. And so it's really kind of funny. And people use this as a classrooms haven't changed much kind of an image. But what it means to me and what I have seen when I visited Oxford University quite a long time ago, and it really struck home for me, was how much science and the teaching of science originated as an anti-religion. And it was a response to the religious teaching of the day. And that so if you've ever been to the Natural History Museum at Oxford, it is a cathedral to science. It is built as a cathedral, in the shape of a cathedral, with those same columns, but instead of horrific scenes of sinners and all the terrible things that happened to them in the rise of the saints and whatever, it's science people. It's Darwin and Newton and all these figures, but all male though, I think, unfortunately. But that's another story and another. but it is a cathedral of science. And so it really occurred to me that, because at that time I was looking at how do we change the way we do life science education? How do we change from the sage on the stage model? How do we go from behind the podium speaking out and thinking, well, that is an awful lot like what a preacher does. That is an awful lot like what a priest or a clergyman does. And that's what, at Oxford at least, that's how science teaching was involved. It wasn't allowed to be taught, and then it was placed as the counter to religion. And I think that's another mindset that we just haven't been able to let go. And so we think about it as we are the experts, and our disciplines are what organize us. And we have this myth, actually, I think it's a myth, people have argued it, of objectivity. And I'm supposed to be removed from the object of study and not relate to it and not be part of it. And that I am part of an elite, a knowledge elite. And that is, and again, you can talk to some people in one extreme that take it that far. Anybody ever heard of the University of Austin that's just been proposed, that's being started, where it's the actual, the most conservative among us of academics that are the most academically purist and intellectually elite, saying that public education, public higher education has lost its way, and that they're just going to go start their own new university that is nothing but academic freedom and intellectual. And it's again, it's like an intellectual monastery. And so there's an extreme there. So I'm just saying we need to be cautious of that, right? We want to be aware if we are going to demonstrate our value and our relevance to public good, we cannot be removed and separate and elite and standing up as the only answer, the only source of truth, because we are not the only source of truth. So instead, the alternative is thinking about what does it mean to be the engaged university? What does it mean to actually engage in the life of the world around us and the life of the community? What does it mean to be directly relevant on a level with them, right? I know that I have a certain amount of expertise, learned knowledge in soil microbiology, which I could happily bore people to death with at any, for any amount of time. I also have a certain amount of lived experience as in leadership and various different things. And so I have learned experience and lived experience, and I have learned knowledge and lived knowledge. And that is what this idea of how can we become more porous and more integrated with the community that we want to engage with, and not completely. And I haven't thrown out my discipline, and I have a manuscript review for biogeochemistry that's at least a month overdue now, but don't tell the editors, because I haven't lost that fascination and that love of my own discipline. But at the same time, I also see that if we're going to be able to address some of what the world needs from us, we do have to think about, well, what does it mean to be appropriately involved and connected and engaged and empathetic and responsive and looking outward and looking at what the world means. And that's a challenge for some of us, not for everyone, right? Others, for many people, that's like, well, of course. But for some, it's a challenge. And just this book, I find really interesting. And you can't really see it. It's Gibbons et al., The New Production of Knowledge. And you can see at the bottom under Ivory Tower and Social Actors, I put Gibbons et al. But mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge production, he makes a distinction. And mode 1 knowledge production is that produced by universities. It's kind of Ivory Tower production of knowledge, and it's theoretical, and it's sort of traditional, what we've done for a really long time. Mode 2 knowledge production is that lived knowledge, that social knowledge. That, when I was in Wisconsin for 10 years, I was on the soil quality team, and I got to go out on farm and work with growers and grazers every single year, every summer, and teach homeschool high school kids and do all of this and be out with them and become very, very aware of how much lived knowledge I did not have about their farm or their soil that had been in their family for 3 generations or longer. And so I could come and say, well, here's some book knowledge about soil ecology that I hope will be useful to you. But if I came with my expert hat, I'm coming from on high from the university to tell them about soil microbiology, it wasn't useful at all. And so there's a real sense there that I think, again, ag colleges, we have a bit more, we're closer to that than, but we do still sit in that kind of danger of forgetting that we're just part of the community that we want to serve. So that's that second big shift, and thinking about that underlying mindset. Who are we? Who do we serve? How do we serve them? Is it by my big giant brain alone? No, not really. right? It's part of here and here. And we haven't been, I think, as good as we could be about acknowledging that. So in short, it goes back to what I had thought of for the title. It means reimagining ourselves. And these are just 3 books that I've read recently that are really tackling this. So Gordon G, The Future of the Land Grants, and there's a lot of work out there looking at what is the next land grant 2.0, and then people are talking about the world grant. And I think that's absolutely true. It's critical and essential that public education, public universities, and in particular, the agriculture campuses and the agriculture faculties are needed and necessary. And then we figure out, well, what is our path forward toward that? What does that look like? And nobody has an answer for that. The Empowered University by Freeman Hrabowski and his executive, he was the president at University of Maryland, Baltimore County for 30 years, which I incredible, and has just stepped down this year, I believe. And so he has this great book looking at how do you have an empowered university, and he talks beautifully about the need to not just have top-down decisions, but that nothing can happen except nothing can happen without all of us, right? That one leader can never know enough and can never have all the right ideas, but that we need to engage the entire university. And he talks also about what does that mean for connection to community. So service learning for our students, entrepreneurship, where are we going with that? How do we connect the university to the world around us? So he talks a bit about that. And then the 5th wave, Michael Crow talks just beautifully about the overall history, and it's relevant to all of North America. He talks about, mostly he centers it in the US, but it's relevant in the waves of universities as they developed from the original Harvard and William and Mary and some of the first universities that were in the US, and then how they became more comprehensive and how they grew and got bigger. And now this 5th wave is connection, again, interconnection and connection to the world. And he actually talks about Gibbon's work as well, and that mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge production. It's a big old book, but it's worth reading if you have any interest in this stuff. I put up practically and ideologically though, because what these books don't tend to talk about. And when I've gone to a few conferences, and I was just in Dublin a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, talking about skills that students need to learn, blah, 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 at a conference for the International Association of Universities. They don't talk about how very well. Again, this is us saying, don't stand on high and pronounce, and yet you go to every single conference and the leadership stands on high and pronounces, and they say the things that we all already know. So I really try hard to think about, well, how do we do it? What does that look like? How does it operationalize? How does it manifest for us on the ground, sitting in this room or at home or wherever? So the big question, how do we do it? And that's the question I'm always asking, well, how? And I keep thinking of it as, this is when I was doing strategic planning in Wisconsin, I called it the 7 levels of how, and somebody thought I was saying the 7 levels of hell. It's the 7 levels of how. So how do we do that? Okay, well, how do we do that? Well, how do we do that? And so on until you don't have any more. But I thought I would just share a few things. So in general, at this level of, okay, how do we do that? What I've seen in the last few years is just some trying to figure out how do we make it tangible. So revising the rewards and incentive systems to legitimize this kinds of engaged scholarship, right? So it's not enough to talk about being community engaged without actually recognizing that everything about the way we're set up works against that. The tenure and promotion systems don't allow it. If we talk about industry engaged and we want people to do more industry engaged work, everything about how we promote and tenure people is set up to work against that. And so we need to think about, well, what else could we do then? How do we fix that? And I know here there was some conversation about the Boyer model, and Boyer has 6 dimensions of scholarship. And then one of our deans went away and said, well, how do we turn that into tenure and promotion? And it was a 6-dimensional times 24 criteria matrix. It was arts, of course. And we're like, this is not usable. So, I don't know if you remember the people at that meeting. They're like, still doesn't work. And I'm nothing if not practical, actually, or maybe I'm not practical all the time, but I try to be practical, and that's not practical. So thinking about how do we revise those rewards and incentive systems so that we can actually get people doing this, support it. how do we remove the barriers and actively support the kinds of transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary? Because it's the same problem. Some of the barriers are it's not recognized, it doesn't fit neatly, you can't get the same dollars for it, who gets credit for having done what? So there's how do we things like that. The linearity and uniformity of our curriculum, this is just one where we think about our curricula tend to be, you start here and you end at point B, and you're supposed to graduate within 4 years, maybe 5, and you have a degree. And it is kind of, again, it's a linear in concept and relatively uniform. Everybody's supposed to take roughly the same stuff, and you might have 2 or 3 spots for electives. I mean, again, ag faculties are better that way. Forget about engineering. You have no choice whatsoever. You will do this and only this. So it's that challenging that in our curriculum is really important. I think about this idea of social relevance and agency. How do we allow our learners the opportunity to practice some of the stuff that we're saying we want to be, so that the system is aligned, so that we are acting consistent with what we're teaching, and that we're teaching things that are consistent with how we say we want to be acting. So I'll give examples of each of these. I have some practical examples, or at least tangible examples. And then finally, we just put the trust. Like, I see so much lack of trust in the executive levels and the places where I've been, where it ultimately comes down to, we may not get it right at first. And we might muck around and wrestle with this, but we're unlikely to break anything beyond fixing. And so why not try and trust that people do actually want to see things change, and that people are capable and willing. So then how do we do that? Next level of how. Just so here's, like I said, I wanted to give a few examples that are maybe just to try to illustrate what I'm talking about. So the idea of legitimizing and operationalizing more than one type of scholarship. This was something that I started talking about while I was here. How do we do this? Modeled after the U.S. Extension program at the land-grant universities. And Health was trying to actually do this. And then I don't know how far along they've gotten, but the idea that we make this analogous to the way we currently use different criteria for research and teaching. So you're not evaluated for tenure and promotion with the same criteria for teaching as you are for research. You can argue whether that's good or bad. I would say it's good. But then you could say, well, what if we had a third category of workload? And you request that you say, okay, part of my work is truly community engaged, and it has a different time scale, different funding sources, different publication outlets, and just different recognition. It's still valid, it's equally valid, but it doesn't fit when we talk about most of the research that we do. So we have a separate evaluation criteria. So I might say, okay, 30% of my research is community engaged, 20% of my research, if it's a 40 or whatever, 10%, I'm trying to work out the percentages. It's either 30% of 40% or 30% of 100% of your research. I don't know how that works. But the idea is you pick a percentage, and then it's a weighted thing. You're evaluated for your community engaged work on the basis of criteria that are agreed upon for community engaged work. And they are different criteria. So it's a legitimate separate category. And so that's kind of that, all that is. Like you could request that part of your FTE or part of your workload is evaluated as community engaged for the purpose of the tenure promotion. And then you use those criteria to determine your performance. So instead of hand waving at community engaged stuff and saying, well, it's not first PI, it's not tri-council funding, it's not in a journal with X impact factor, it's actually supposed to be different and equally valid. So one of the things that might be worth playing with or thinking about or chatting about was something that we were having fun starting to look at in health, was this framework for where our research fits. And so you could think about research, who is it that's benefiting from the work? Is it the researcher or is it a stakeholder of some kind? So it's a way to start to define this a little better. So is it community driven, the questions that I'm asking, or is it driven by my own intellectual curiosity? And then the other axis is the intellectual impact versus the social impact of it. So who is it? Who's it affecting? Who's benefiting? I guess that's what who's benefiting. And then you can think about where your research sits, right? So when I did some stuff that was literally, it was pure organic geochemistry, thinking about carbon sequestration that had very little, I try to tell the funding agencies it has massive application for everything. It's going to solve climate change, but it really didn't. And, it was published in Nature, but okay, so it had a high impact journal, but it was truly intellectual, hopefully some intellectual impact, but entirely researcher driven, right? So it's set up in that quadrant, and it was legitimate and it was good and we had fun doing it, and the lab benefited and students got PhDs, and that's great. But a lot of the other stuff that I did was actually going out and working on farm with the growers and the grazers, and the grazers would say, look, when we shift from row crop agriculture from corn to pasture, we noticed that 4 or 5 years into pasture, the productivity of our grasses declined substantially. And we'd really like to understand why. And so I was working with them to look at microbial community dynamics, nutrient cycling, and say what's happening in the soil here that is affecting the productivity of the pastures. And that was community driven, hopefully with some degree of social impact, and looking at that productivity slump and understanding the microbiological basis for it, which was really because it's a point where the community is shifting from those that are accustomed to high input, lots and lots of nitrogen, lazy microbes, lazy. They forgot how to get nitrogen from carbon from organic sources. And then after about that 3 or 4 years, then the community has to shift and adjust to no more nitrogen inputs. So that's the short answer to a lot of thinking and work that went into that. But anyway, to me, there's a way to start to play with this when you think about where your research fits and how we legitimize the kind of work that we do and why we do it. Or even just to explain it to others, right? When we talk to the government and they say, well, why isn't it all over here on this side? Why are you doing anything over here? And so we say, well, because we do have to have sandboxes and we do have to have things that we do where we're just discovering stuff. So there's that. So why is it important? It legitimizes that community engaged work as true scholarship. It really is true scholarship. It's more than just service to society. So when I was doing that, it wasn't just that I was going out and talking to folks because I was trying to tick off a box in my service requirement to get tenure or promoted. And it holds us accountable for the work that we do, which is a good thing too. It allows for that flexibility and workload. It's a lot simpler than Goyer, but it can still have a really profound impact. Especially for some of our colleagues whose work is a lot more community engaged. Everybody's all different places on that spectrum. And it could be done for other types of engagement, right? You can look at it for industry engaged work as well. So example 1, when we think about building capacity for transdisciplinarity, this is something that I was working on in the last year or so. At Calgary, try to think about how do we operationalize transdisciplinarity. It's one thing to just simply say grand challenges, we must fix them all, and that doesn't work very well again when we have a whole system set up against it. And so with 2 things that I was calling for. One was to build this specific strategy or action plan around transdisciplinarity. Now, the University of Calgary, if anybody knows it, loves strategies. I mean, it's insane. But not only that every faculty has their own strategic plan, and there's kind of a strategic plan for the whole university, but not really. There are 7 other institutional strategies that have to be approved and go through the whole governance structure, all the way up through the academic senate equivalent that they have. One for everything. So I said, well, let's just throw another one in there. Let's throw transdisciplinarity in there too. But it actually had some value. So there was a group working really hard on what are the high level recommendations around how do you increase the transdisciplinary work that happens? What has to be out of the way? How do we fund it? How do we provide support for risky ideas? How do we change, again, tenure and promotion criteria to allow for this to happen? So that's what that first one was about. The second one was actually thinking about how do we, so when I started this, trying to talk to people about this, every institute across campus all said, but we do transdisciplinary, we're already transdisciplinary, we're already doing this. And so I said, well, fine, then let's create a coalition and have a charter document and have an alliance and support one another instead of trying to recreate the wheel. So it's again, tangible and practical. The tangible practical part is that we set aside funding to hire internal excellence, which was the ITS professorships. So faculty who wanted to do this work could be hired into the Institutes for Transdisciplinary Studies, 20% or more of their time taken away, bought out, opportunity for seed funding for transdisciplinary grants, and postdoctoral scholars as well that were hired in as ITS scholars to do the work. So it was saying, let's make sure this work can happen and fund it appropriately. So money and then internal excellence as well as people hired from the outside. The postdocs were given 6-year positions. Well, that was the intent, to give them 6-year positions so they could be principal investigators on tri-council grants, but also You can find.
Thank you.
So that's what the IPS was, right? So it was an idea there that is taking shape. So the why it's important. Again, it legitimizes and builds support for the societally relevant problems, the grand challenge kind of work. And it's encouraging the development of capacity and talent for the work that does stand to schools. It's letting people know this is legit and we want you to do it. We're going to give you money and we're going to invite you to be part of a community that's working on this. And something that I had thought about quite a bit is how do we actually mobilize across the university to tackle these hardest problems that we're facing, these grand challenges. And so this is another book, Tackling Wicked Problems. And so a lot of these really are wicked problems, but it says through transdisciplinary imagination. All right. It doesn't let me move the slides while they're multitasking. It's not my fault. I didn't do it.
It's my fault.
Terry, yeah, when you talked about the Institute for Transdisciplinary Studies, you said that there was funding available. Was that funding that the university allocated out of its kind of operational budget, or did you get external funding to?
It was not external funding. It had been set aside as strategic funding.
Okay.
So it had been, it was part of that, which is general strategic funds that were out there.
So the university said it's important, we're gonna allocate some money to this.
Yeah,
Okay.
I imagine it might be something that could get external funding if we've got the right person interested in it. But in this case, it was set aside and protected when the government dropped the budget, the operating budget by 30% over 3 years. So fortunately, it wasn't all gone. But that was the idea, was like everyone says, right? If you really want something to happen, you got to be able to have the money to put toward it.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to talk about it. So that's in the process of being created. So it's why it's important. And then the third example was transforming the curriculum. And I mentioned already, university curriculum tends to be linear, right? You tend to have kind of one endpoint in mind. We don't tend to have lots of ways into, through, out, back in, and around and around. So we're not organic in that way. So that's not really the point. It's just to remind us that the curriculum there's things we can do with the curriculum along these lines as well. So I wanted to give just an example from when I was at the University of Florida. And we created a project that I had an idea for when I was at Wisconsin, brought it with me to Florida. We called it the Challenge 2050 project. And the goal with this was, how do we sustain human well-being beyond 2050 when we have 9 to 11 billion people on the planet? It started as sort of thinking a little bit about food security, but then it was really like, well, it's more than just food security. How do we sustain human well-being? And so it really ties into sustainable development goals, different things like that. And really thinking about the transdisciplinary nature of sustainability itself, but really based on challenge-based education, but even broader than that, trying to think about this idea of how does the university connect itself to the rest of the world? So the goal that we had was, and this was my goal, is have a big hairy goal, because why not? Build the leadership capacity needed to address complex global problems and sustain human well-being beyond 2050. Simple, no problem. But this crazy goal was enough to attract the attention of HM Clothes, which is a seed company that was based in Davis, which is one of the daughter companies of Limagrain, which at that time was the 3rd largest seed company in the world, that was based in Paris. And so I had a dinner with the CEO of HM Clothes in Davis, and he got interested in this crazy idea of how do we actually build global leadership capacity to sustain human well-being. And so I went to Paris and pitched it, and it was funded with some seed funding, seed funding from the seed company. Seed money. I take lessons from that. But so the vision that we had, and this was Florida, was that we would have this global coalition, and I got to sign us onto a Peace Corps Masters that would give the students credit for having done Peace Corps and move them toward a master's degree program. We were working with USAID, and we had other connections. And so we were thinking about this as truly big, a big grand idea. And how do we make that happen? So the vision was that this would be a global coalition with the objective of creating programs that would develop and empower leaders at all levels. So we were leveraging some work that was already happening at the University of Florida, which is they had a mortgage leadership institute. Not mortgage, I'm thinking of the wrong one. Anyway, forget that. if not the mortgages, they're very rich. They like to give money to lots of things. This wasn't it. But there was a leadership institute already at Florida. And then we wanted to look at students all the way up through every sector of society and bringing them all together and implement innovative, bold, and visionary solutions. Right. So we were saying, well, how do we get people together to think the big thoughts and to really imagine what could be and create that free space and build that global coalition of leaders and leadership capacity. So it was, we had proposed programming that was across all the sectors, so something for everybody basically. And we had a challenge summit that was going to happen every year in an institute. So that would be a leadership institute bringing together people from industry and public sector and the academic world, and together regularly for a summit and an institute that we had programming planned for public sectors. And that we had an undergraduate certificate and a master's degree planned that was engaging with industry leaders and international travel. But what was really cool was that it also spanned these 5 systems is what I was, we're going to sustain human well-being beyond 2050. And we have to think not just about the food system of any given place or location, but the food, economic, environmental, social, and health systems. And so we were thinking about these grand challenges and problems through the lens of these 5 different systems. And so we brought students to Haiti, for example, and in Haiti, it's not the food system that's the problem as much as it's the economic system. So economic and social and infrastructure in Haiti is lacking, but food grows readily in Haiti. And so the food system was not the driver of the problem, a limiting factor. Anyway, so it was designed to span disciplines. So we started with this challenge-based education, challenge certificate, and launched this. And this actually won 5 or 6 years ago a U.S. Leadership Education Award, National Award, for the work that was done. And so we taught this in a first semester where it was a campus-wide course that was an introduction to the high. So we invited any student that wanted to partake in this and come together and address humanity's grand challenge, right? The biggest challenge, keeping ourselves alive on this planet with 9 to 11 billion people. And we had a really great interest from the students. That's one of the reasons it became so successful. And the students would work in teams for 2 years. They were working in partnership with industry. They were working on real things, real problems. And they presented all their work to industry leaders as well as academic stakeholders, and it was very highly hands-on, right? So it's experiential, it's all this stuff. And it was really, really fun to teach. Now, this might be too small to see, I'm not sure, but what I was looking for is how do we shift the students from a learner focus, a learning by self-centered, like I want to get my good grades, I want to make sure that I do okay, I want my degree. It's not selfish, it's more me focused, because that's how we've set up higher education, to an outward shift, a more sense of social responsibility. How do I contribute to solving the problems in the world, and how can I contribute? Where we've got people who are traditional age don't tend to think that they don't know how. They don't think they can in a lot of ways. So this was kind of coaching, mentoring, and working with them. And so we set this up where it was really quite a simple, boring looking class on the surface, where we put the students in teams and we had guest lectures. That's super boring. But what we did at the same time was work with the students directly to have them challenge the lecturers to be working in teams on a challenge that they picked, related to tended to be more local food security kinds of issues, but they were working on something very, very real that they were going to deliver. And that gave them more of a sense of what we saw. This is some data that I collected through the class, through the teaching of the class. So these are data driven with ethics approval and all of that from studying what the students were learning and the impact it was having. And there's a paper that we wrote based on this as well. But they were developing this sense of global awareness, cognitive awareness of the problems. They were developing empathy. They were starting to look outward toward the problems that the world was facing. And they became empowered actors through what we did with them with the service learning and the challenge that they were addressing. So I like the students' voices to speak better. So the other outcome is that they were empowered and they had that developed sense of agency, which is I can do stuff. I now have a sense of how to go about solving a problem. And so this is just a few of my favorite quotes from the students' reflections on their learning. Regardless of your role, you can contribute to the solution. Whether you're a doctor, a stay-at-home mom, or anything else, you have the power to contribute to a better tomorrow. That's not what my students say when I start with them at the beginning of soil microbiology 323. They don't say that at the end of soil microbiology 323. It's terrible. They say other things, but not like that. But the discussions definitely got me thinking. Sometimes they scared me to death, but they made me think about what I can do and what we can do to address them so that our world is not so scary in the future. What I loved is that when we invited the guest speakers, I had to warn the guest speakers that they needed to leave lots of time for questions because these students would stop them every 2 minutes and grill them because that's what we were teaching them and really challenge them. And so we had guest speakers come in and talk about their areas of expertise. So we had somebody come in and scare us away from open food buffets for the rest of our lives because they talked about, it was plant pathology and pathologists talking about all the nasties and the things that grow in this food. And I just, because we were talking about how 30% of loss of food in the world is storage and spoilage and in the developing world and in the here world, it's stuff we throw away that we waste. But anyway, so the students talk to the guest speakers and really challenge them. They recognize that the problem then starts to make sense and that they see where they can play a part in the solution. And then finally, they recognize that we have to do this together. And it's not just any one person's responsibility. We need others, and it's this together aspect. I think that reflects everything that we want to think about with the university. Like I said, I aligned. This is how we want to be. It's how we want to be teaching. It's how we want our students and our learners to be with us. So why it's important, it's this kind of socially relevant content raised the awareness for the students and it broadened the learning and broadened the thinking. The class elements impacted attitude and the classroom climate. This was a class that everybody challenged each other respectfully. There was a lot of dialogue, a lot of really just intense conversation, which led to these kinds of outcomes that were about social responsibility. And then the students were able to act in a way that will improve the future. There's no doubt about it. And that we can all benefit from that. So there's a huge reasons why this is important. So last slide, ultimately, as I mentioned, the world is changing faster and faster. Public sentiment is turning away from us, which is really a shame because we need us. So we need to think about how we revise and reimagine ourselves so that we can reinforce that value that we have and how we operate, who we serve, how do we serve them, in what ways. Which means we really need to be willing to question those unconscious models that are driving us and really be conscious about it, deliver it, embrace that non-linearity as well as the tradition. Keep what works, keep what we want to keep, but question things so that we aren't keeping the wrong things for the wrong reasons. And really think about that collective and collaborative action that engages us with the world and supports the world and acknowledges that value of the non-academic lived experience or that lived learning, not just the book learning, because we need that too. So that to me is ultimately what it's all about. And I really do think that we can do it. And it takes that imagination and that willingness to just give things a try. And this is a picture of that Challenge 2050 class. I've never had a class ask to take a group photo before, and they just so enjoyed working with each other. It was relatively small, and I think we could scale up the model, but the model worked really well. So with that, if anyone has any time left, because I'm sure I talked way too long because I didn't have this stuff. Thoughts, ideas, questions, cookies, veggies, caffeine.
Thank you, Terry, for this. Kathleen here. I am interested in how you see this maybe aligning with decolonization efforts, since they are also our concurrent. And you talked about multiple ways of knowing and valuing perspectives. I wonder if you could speak to weaving those together.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different places. It is absolutely true. Even just that shift in mindset and attitude is aligned to this idea of multiple ways. So we, in the Indigenous strategy, one of the 7 strategies at Calgary, it is ways of knowing, being, doing, and connecting are the bases, and then the recognition that there are other ways to approach knowledge. And so I think if we weave that into, we talk about challenging the curriculum, and we talk about the criteria and what's legitimate when we think about how we promote someone or tenure them, really thinking about those lenses of ways of knowing, being, doing, and connecting can be valuable. So it absolutely, I see them as completely aligned. And it's much more of a shift away from, and I didn't want to bring up too much about colonial versus decolonial or non-colonial, but that idea of what we have right now is very colonial, right? And moving it toward a much less colonial model is highly aligned to indigenization.
Nice.
This is Goddard. Basically, my understanding is there's a need for change.
Mhm.
The question is, and also I see from your presentation, there are some movements going on, but how quickly we need to do and what's your projection to quickly to adopt these new changes, given the bureaucracy that we have in
Right.
the school system?
Right, well, one answer about how quickly is before the government does us in, but I'm not gonna, I didn't say that. No, I mean, there's a real. It's easy to sit back and say, we'll do it tomorrow. And so I think what's really key is starting to find little pockets or places where we can nucleate some new thinking or try some new things, where it feels accessible and easy to do. Find the people that want to try something. I think we're all just too exhausted by COVID and by all the changes in this port campus that's seen 1,000 different changes in the last 5 years with fires and this and that and new buildings and nobody wants to think about wholesale change right now. And that totally makes sense to me. But I think there are little bits and pieces where, again, if we think about how do we remove the barriers? I like the mindset of removing barriers rather than forcing people to charge through them or jump over them or do it anyway, but really thinking about how do we make it easier? So we recognize it's valuable. We recognize that governments are changing and they are increasingly seeking more oversight. And they're looking into and questioning in more detail what universities do, and that worries me. And I don't want to wait until something bad happens for us to then respond, but to get out ahead of it and start to show, hey, we are employing people and we are producing students who are able to get a job within a year of graduation, but they're also able to stay employed for 10 years afterward, which is a challenge that I've had with some of the government conversations I've had here and in Alberta. It's not enough to just say how many people are employed a year later. It's, are they still employed 10 years later? Because that's what I hope I'm creating. But anyway, I think there isn't a cliff that's like right here, but then we didn't expect COVID either. Right, and so I think there's might be ways to make things easier and remove some of those barriers and find where we can get started. Because it is a complex system, right? And complex systems, you don't know what lever to push. That's going to be the thing that shifts the whole system. So.
Question online.
Oh, question up here.
What are the biggest barriers that you see in leadership that holds us?
Sorry. Don't even get me started on that one. The biggest barriers. I think the biggest barrier, honestly, I will tell you, in all honesty, I think it's that unfortunately that as people tend to rise in level and start to hold more and more power, they get very resistant to sharing that power. And they don't have an example of what that looks like, that they've seen that's successful. And think about our training as academics. I'm thinking we're academic leaders, right? Our training as academics is that we're supposed to be the expert. And it's peer evaluation, peer review. It's peer critique, peer ripping into shreds, right? The reviewer too is everywhere. So we are trained to think that we have to have the answer. And it is not a safe environment out there. And it's very hard to shift that and let that go if you rise or you're promoted. And I see that's what's happening. I've seen that in multiple countries too. I'm not pointing fingers at any one particular individual or place. But I think that is really one of the biggest challenges that we face is having leadership understand it's not their job to know everything. And that the smartest person in the room is the room, right? It's everybody. And that we are collectively a lot more effective than any one person could possibly be, especially now. There's no way that everybody is going to know everything. And that's how I've tried to approach things, which is engage people, ask them. And I'm worried about coming out of COVID because it's very seductive to be able to say, we have a crisis, do it because I said so. And it's very hard to come back from that and remember that not everything is a crisis and that we need to take the time to build the relationships, to get people's feedback, to get their input and not erase that. So I hopefully that's a decent enough. I'm looking at the owl and the people in this. But that I do really see that it's our relationship with power and how we use it and what we do really makes a difference.
I have one, maybe the last question and then
There's a hand here too. Over here.
Lori, do you want to go first?
Oh, I just want to say, it's not really a question, but I think in order to do some of the ideas that you're mentioning, we need to change the way we're working. You can't bring, people that may be, working, let's say, you need to come to the table really refreshed
Yeah,
to get new ideas. And you kind of did say something about curriculum and kind of challenging our curriculum and our structure. Like, I think in order to do some of this, some of the structure has to change to allow people the space to do this.
yeah, I agree. I agree. One of the things that I was trying to do here when I created the Provost Fellows Program and things that I've created in other places is to try to give people the implicit, but also the structural permission. So to say, I'm gonna buy out 20% of your time because I want you to work on this cool thing that you want to work on anyway. But I'm gonna make sure you have the space to do that. I think it's really critical that we manage talent. I hate that word. It's an HR term, but that we do that differently, that we recognize that people are gonna do more when they're doing something they really believe in and they wanna be doing. And that we should leverage that. And we shouldn't treat everybody as equivalent or uniform because they aren't. And so I think we do the same thing to our teachers or to our, not so much to our researchers. We recognize that research is uniquely distinct and everybody does something slightly differently, but we don't do that with our teachers or our staff as much, right? That everybody's got different interests, everybody's got different strengths. And so you're right, the infrastructure, the structure, the way we approach things needs to shift to accommodate the fact that people are individuals and they have different things they want to be working on and different strengths and different interests.
Just lastly then, so I know some of the European countries, Denmark, I think, has gone to project-based learning in the P-12 system. Have you seen a university that has done that well? Like, who can we look to for?
That's what I was trying to do with the Challenge 2050, actually, is because I had encountered challenge-based learning. I don't remember what conference it was, but Apple Computer was piloting it in the grades. And it was being used up through the, not quite grade 12, but up through the earlier grades. And I hadn't seen it used at a university. And so I wanted to try it out and it was really well received, but I haven't seen, there's problem-based learning, so PBL, there's other things, but we tend to treat it as more co-curricular or extracurricular rather than actually building curriculum around it. I used to talk a lot about what I called the flipping the pyramid. So rather than building a base of everything that everybody needs to know, but they have no idea why they need to know it, and then eventually you reach a capstone, that you flip that. And it's what engineering foundation years have done, where they've started with design and they've started with learning that used to be that, though they don't have enough background yet, they can't understand this. Well, yeah, they can understand it and they can do it. And it's shifting from pushing information to creating a situation where they're pulling it, because you can't stop somebody from learning if it's something they're really interested in. And so you get them interested by project-based, by challenges. And then they say, okay, well, I need to know this, or I need to know this, or I need to know coding, or I need to know that. And they bring it all toward the thing they're interested in. Very much like what I was just saying about the teachers all being unique and having interests and strengths that are distinct. Same with learners.
On that note, I know it's late and people might have
Yes.
places to
thank
be,
you,
but
sorry.
know that we're gonna stay for a few minutes. You're welcome to have some more snacks and.
Thank you, everybody at home.
Yes, thanks for joining, and I have a little gift, nothing to pack the suitcase too full on.